he just kept making excuses why he couldn't go. I don't think Joseph seen himself as a hero either. He was sold into slavery by his brothers. Whenever he was bought as a slave, he started to rise up in the family. Then he got accused of something he didn't do and went to prison. I'm sure he didn't see himself as having the potential of being a hero. But know it or not, oftentimes we are heroes in other people's eyes. To parents, most of the time your children look up to you as being a hero. To grandparents, oftentimes your grandkids look up to you as being a hero for them. Spouses, sometimes your husband or your wife looks at you as being a hero. I know I do Nellie. She's always been my rock and my best friend. Or maybe it's somebody that you work with. They see the way that you react around or react with different pressures in your life, and they look up to you. Sometimes it's the younger generation is looking up to the older generation. But we don't see ourselves as having that potential. But I think that when we doubt our potential, we begin to doubt God's strength that he can work in our life. Today we are going to look at an Old Testament figure who had so many obstacles set before him. It could have been easy for him just to throw his hands up in the air and say, I quit, I'm done, I can't do this any longer. But Daniel never gave up. So before we dive into the story of Daniel, I kind of want to set the stage for you a little bit so you kind of know what's going on. When studying the history of Israel, it's the history of the Old Testament, there's two dates that are very significant for understanding at least 2/3 of the entire Old Testament. But before, we need to understand that after Solomon's reign, after King David's son, Solomon, reigned, Israel was divided into two different kingdoms. You had the northern kingdom, which was called Israel. You had the southern kingdom, which was called Judah. That's where Jerusalem was. That's where the temple was built. So the first date is 722 BC. That's the date that the Assyrians came in and they conquered the northern kingdom, Israel. Jews were deported to Assyria. Some Assyrians came to Israel. They did that so that they could keep people from revolting and trying to take their land back. But they also did that in the hopes that the Israelites would come into the Assyrians' way of life. And some of them did. That's where we get the Samaritans from. That's why the Jews hated Samaritans so much, is because they was half Jew, half Assyrian. They considered them a half-breed, a traitor to their own people. The second date that we need to know is 586 BC. This is the year that the Babylonians came in and they conquered the nation of Judah. They destroyed Jerusalem and they destroyed the temple. Something that the Jews could have never imagined could have ever happened. One of the most devastating things that could ever take place to a Jew. Because the temple is where God dwelt among his people. But now it was destroyed. And like the Assyrians, the Babylonians came in and they took many of the Jews and they took them back to Babylon. Daniel was one of them. Daniel descended from one of Judah's prominent families, and he could possibly have royal blood. But at an early age, somewhere around 12 or 18, he was taken from his family to be trained in the courts of Babylon. Could you imagine being in that position? Having all of these hopes and dreams laid before you. You've got a bright future ahead, but now all your hopes and dreams are taken away. That bright future that you once had is now a future of a slave. You ever felt that way? That at one moment you had so many hopes and dreams. Your future looked bright. You had so many goals that you wanted to achieve, but then something happened. Maybe it was an accident. an incident, an addiction. Maybe it was your addiction or someone that you loved's addiction. And then all of a sudden, everything's changed. You've lost your hopes and dreams. The future becomes uncertain. That's where Daniel found himself. But he never lost his faith. Now, before we jump into Daniel chapter 6, it's a story that most of us know very well. It's the story of Daniel and the lion's den. It's one of those stories that go up there with Noah's Ark and the 10 plagues and different stories like that of the Old Testament. But I want to say before we dive into it, that oftentimes when we become so familiar with a story, we begin to shut out. We just either read over it quickly, or if a preacher begins to preach on that topic, well, that gives me time to think about what I'm going to eat for lunch or what groceries I need to get this week. But don't shut out. Understand that even though this might be a story that you know backward and forward, there's still things that we can always learn from. So let us dive right in. Daniel chapter 6, starting with verse 1. It said, "It pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 satraps to be throughout the whole kingdom, and over them 3 high officials, of whom Daniel was one, to whom the satraps should give an account, so that the king might suffer no loss." So if we're to look at the hierarchy that's in place here, you have Darius, who is king over Babylon. He's at the very top. Right below him, you have the 3 high officials, Daniel being one of those officials. And below those 3 high officials, you have the 120 satraps. Now, most of us don't know what a satrap is. We've never heard of it before. But basically what it is they would send somebody out to govern kind of a province, to govern some land. And these 120 satraps would then come back to the high officials, report to them. The high officials would then report to the king. But the king had a different idea. He wanted a different hierarchy than what had been put in place. So in verse 3 it says, "Then this Daniel became distinguished above all the other high officials and satraps, because an excellent spirit was in him," or excellent character. "And the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom." So there's a hierarchy change. It's going to now be King Darius, Daniel, the 2 other high officials, and then the 120 satraps. How do you think those other 2 high officials are feeling by this point? You know, the jealousy begins to kick in. Why is Daniel going to become the vice king or vice president of all of Babylon? Why him? So they begin to look through his life to see if they could find anything wrong. Verse 4, it says, "Then the high officials and the satraps sought to find grounds for complaint against Daniel with regards to the kingdom. But they could find no grounds for complaint or any fault, because he was faultless, and no error or fault was found in him. Then these men said, 'We shall not find any grounds for complaint against this Daniel unless we find it in connection with the law of his God.'" So you've got now 2 high officials and 120 satraps. You don't have to be very good at math to figure out there's 122 people that's diving into Daniel's life. See if they can find any inconsistencies. See if they can find anything that might be wrong with his character. Throughout this sermon, we're going to ask the same question over and over. The question is simply, how about you? If 122 people dived into your life, what would they find? Would they find that your integrity was spotless? Would they find that same thing that they found with Daniel? They dived into every aspect of his life. They found nothing. I was going through this sermon this week, trying to prepare it, and asking these questions really made me begin to think as well. Because I think every single one of us here is thinking if 122 people dived into my life, afraid of what they might find. Because we're all sinful. We're not perfect. So since they couldn't find anything in Daniel's life, his integrity was too great, they came up with a plan. And in verse 6, it says, "Then these high officials and the satraps came by agreement to the king and said to him, 'O King Darius, live forever. All the high officials of the kingdom, the prefects and the satraps and the counselors and the governors,'" so they've added more people into their onslaught against Daniel. "The governors are agreed that the king should establish an ordinance and enforce an injunction that whoever makes petition to any god or man for 30 days except to you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions. Now, O king, establish the injunction and sign the document so that it cannot be changed according to the law of the Medes and the Persians," basically according to the law of the land, "which cannot be revoked. Therefore, King Darius signed the document and the injunction." You see what they're doing? Not only are they trying to set a trap for Daniel, because they know how much his integrity is. They know that he is going to continue doing exactly what he's doing because he's fully devoted to God. But they're also playing on Darius's ego. Here's a king. Now let's make a decree that nobody can ask anybody for anything except for you. Let's place you on that level as God. And as a king, his head starts to get bigger and bigger, and he's like, that's a great idea. If we look throughout the kings of Babylon, so many of them were arrogant. That was their downfall. And that's what we see here. So now they've made a decree that if anybody prays, they're going to be executed. They're going to be thrown into the lions. Now, you know the rest of the story, but let's think about it. What did Daniel do? What would you do? If you knew that you couldn't pray, if you prayed and you was caught praying, you would be executed. What would you do? Would you change your prayer habits? Would you make for sure that you hid away from everything instead of the way that you used to pray before? Or would you just stop praying altogether? Verse 10, it says, "When Daniel knew that the document had been signed, he went to his house where he had windows in his upper chamber open toward Jerusalem. He got down on his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before his God, as he had done previously. Then these men came by agreement and found Daniel making petitions and pleas before his God. As soon as he heard that it was signed, he goes straight to his house, he goes straight to his room, and he begins to pray. He knew what could happen, but he does it anyway. The amazing thing for me is looking at how did he pray. First of all, it says that he prayed with thanksgiving. But looking at the fact that he's praying with thanksgiving kind of shocks me, especially when you think about it. It says that there was a window open toward Jerusalem. This time, Jerusalem is destroyed. His homeland, the temple, it's all gone. But he's still thanking God. You know, I don't know about you, but if that happened to me, if everything that I knew, everything that I loved was destroyed, and I was taken off as a slave, no matter what happened after that, and I faced toward that city, I'm not for sure my prayers would be a prayer of thanksgiving. They might consist of something a little different. But Daniel's praying thanksgiving to God. That's the first thing that he goes to. Oftentimes, I think in our prayer life, we ask God for too much rather than thanking him for what he has done. You know, Daniel does ask him for strength, or It says that he lays his petitions and pleas before God. But he makes for sure to thank God. Oftentimes, even looking at my own life and looking at my prayer life, it's, God, help me with this. Help me get through this. Be with me in this instance. Instead of, God, thank you for always being with me with everything that I have faced in my life. You have never laughed. And I know you won't now. It's a difference from continue going to him and asking that he will give you things compared to thanking him for all that he has already done. So Daniel prayed with thanksgiving, but he also did pray for petitions. He did plead to God. Now, we're not really for sure what he prayed for, but if I had to guess, I'm sure he's praying for strength. Because he knows what could happen if he continues to pray, so he's praying to God that God would give him the strength to continue on in his faith. Maybe he's praying for guidance, that God would show him exactly what he wanted him to do. But the main point of it is this. He knew where to go in the midst of crisis. This was a major crisis. This was a crisis of life and death. So he went to God. The very first thing he did was go to God because he knew that was the only place that he could find strength. So let me ask the question. Do you think that this 122 men or so were able to sneak up on Daniel while he was praying? Or do you think Daniel heard them coming, but nothing was going to interfere with him praying? I think it's the second one. I think he heard them coming. I think he knew they was going to come straight there. I think he knew that the entire reason this decree was put into motion to begin with was to set him in a trap. So I think he knew they was coming. But nothing was going to stop him from praying. Now, we know the rest of the story. We know that God did save him from the lion's den, that he shut the lion's mouth, and he was taken out the very next day. But Daniel didn't. Daniel didn't know what was going to happen. He didn't know if he was going to be executed. He could have thought that God would rescue him. But he doesn't know for sure. He's not seen the rest of the story. I love what three of his closest friends said, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. By that time, Nebuchadnezzar had set up a golden statue and said that everybody must bow down and worship it. Well, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego wasn't going to bow down and worship. So they gave him another chance to bow down, and they still said, we're not going to bow down. So they're getting ready to throw them in this fiery furnace, and this is what they say. They say, our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace. And he will deliver us out of your hands, O king. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. I think that's the same heart Daniel had. God will deliver me from the lion's den. But even if he doesn't, I'm still going to pray. I'm still going to continue with my faith. So are we as devoted to prayer as Daniel was? What keeps us from praying more? You know, I thought about that in my own life. What keeps me from praying? And for me, oftentimes, it's either a lack of self-esteem. I don't feel worthy enough to boldly go to the throne room of grace. Sometimes I make excuses that I'm just too busy to pray, knowing that I could make the time. We all make up those reasons. Why we don't pray more. Let's go back to the story. Starting with verse 12. It says, then they came near and said before the king concerning the injunction, O king, did you not sign an injunction that anyone who makes petition to any god or man within 30 days except for you, O king, shall be cast into the lions? Now let me ask, don't you hate when somebody is making a statement in the form of a question? Well, it's not a question at all, it's a statement. It says, didn't you, O king? You remember what you did. Remember that? says, "The king answered and said, 'The thing stands fast, according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be revoked.' Then they answered and said before the king, Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, Daniel, who is not one of us." Really not for sure why he's in the government to begin with. "Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, O king, or the injunction that you have signed, but makes his petition 3 times a day." Then the king, when he heard these words, was much distressed and set his mind to deliver Daniel. And he labored till the sun went down to rescue him. Then these men came by agreement to the king and said to the king, "Know, O king, that it is a law of the Medes and the Persians, that no injunction or ordinance that the king established can be changed." Then the king commanded that Daniel was brought and cast into the den of lions. The king declared to Daniel, "May your God, whom you serve continuously, deliver you." And a stone was brought and laid on the mouth of the den. And the king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the signet of the Lord's, that nothing might be changed concerning Daniel. Basically, what's that meaning is the stone has been rode against basically a side of a rock or something, and they've sealed it. It's like if you get an envelope in the mail and you flip it over and it's got a sticker on it that shows that this has not been opened. That's kind of what's going on here. It says, "Then the king went to his palace and spent the night fasting. No diversions were brought to him, and fled from him. Then at break of day the king rose and went in haste to the den of lions. As he came near to the den where Daniel was, he cried out in a tone of anguish. The king declares to Daniel, 'O Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continuously, been able to deliver you from the lions?' Then Daniel said to the king, 'O king, live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lion's mouth. And they have not harmed me, because I was found blameless before him and also before you, O king. I have done no harm.' And the king was exceedingly glad and commanded that Daniel be taken up out of the den." As we read through that story, one of the things that strikes me the most is this relationship that seems to be between Darius and Daniel. It's more than a king and a vice king. It's more than Darius is afraid of losing a trusted government official. There seems to be a friendship here, or some kind of relationship. Because in verse 14 it says that the king was distressed, that he did everything that he could to save Daniel. 18 tells us that the king fasted, that he had no entertainment, whatever that might be, brought to him, and he couldn't sleep. At the break of day, the king went with haste to the den. I don't know if you've ever thought about this, but kings don't do anything in haste. They send somebody else to do it for them. Everybody else has to wait on the king. He doesn't do anything in haste. But here, Darius is running to the den to see if Daniel had made it. When Darius gets there, he cries out in an anguished voice. When Daniel responds back to him, the scripture says that Darius was exceedingly glad. There was a relationship there. Like I said, more than a king and vice king. Now, some have said that Darius is responding out of guilt. Possibility. But let me throw something else out there. I think that maybe they didn't consider each other friends, but Darius knew Daniel very well. And I love how Darius always describes and talks to Daniel. Because 3 times in the chapter, Darius says to Daniel, "May your God, whom you serve continuously, deliver you." So one last time. Would those who are closest to you say that you serve God continuously? Or you worship him on Sunday, and come Monday and Wednesday, you kind of serve your own desires? Would they say that you worship him continuously or serve him continuously, or only when other Christians are around? You know, when writing these questions, it forced me to think about it myself. How would others, those closest to me, describe me? They say that I serve them continuously. Maybe that I serve them passionately. Maybe that I serve them most of the time, maybe more often than not. Serve him continuously. Now, I wasn't trying to beat myself up, but I know that I'm a far cry from this Daniel. And when I look at this story of Daniel in the lion's den, and I see the great miracle that God saved Daniel from being eaten alive, I think there's a second miracle that a lot of people miss. And that's what happens next. It says, so Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no kind of harm was done on him, because he had trusted in his God. And the king commanded that those men who had maliciously accused Daniel were brought and cast into the den of lions. So this could be the two high officials. This could be the 122, not for sure. They, their children, and their wives. So you've got anywhere from 12 to hundreds thrown in. And before they reached the bottom of the den, the lions overpowered them and broke all of their bones in pieces. Then King Darius wrote to all of the people, nations, and languages. This is one of the biggest kingdoms that the world has ever seen up to this point in history. To all the languages that dwell in all the earth, peace be multiplied to you. I make a decree that in all my royal dominion, people are to tremble and fear before the God of Daniel. For he is the living God, enduring forever. His kingdom shall never be destroyed, and his dominion shall be to the end. He delivers and rescues. He works signs and wonders in heaven and on earth. He who has saved Daniel from the power of the lions. So this Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. Because of Daniel's integrity, because Daniel was devoted to prayer, God was able to use him to reach hundreds, possibly thousands or millions of people, showing them that he was the only true God, that he is a God of deliverance, and that his kingdom will never come to an end. So if God is able to use a man who at his early age was taken from his home, all of his hopes, his dreams, his future was instantly taken away. His future was uncertain. If God was able to use him, what can he do with your life if you're just allowed him to lead? Now, before you say, but Daniel was an extremely righteous man, and I'm far from that, I ask you, please don't miss the rest of this series. Because God was able to use many men who were far from perfect. What we have to remember is that God is a God who delivers. God delivered Daniel from the lion's den. But he has delivered us from the bondage of sin and the guilt that comes with it. So we're going to turn our life over to him and follow him and allow him to use us. That choice is yours. Come now as we stand and sing.